What if the two greatest generals of antiquity, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, had faced off in a battle for supremacy over the Mediterranean? Who would have won, the Macedonian genius with his phalanx and cavalry, or the Roman reformer with his legions and discipline? Why does comparing armies separated by 3 centuries of history still excite the imagination? Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar are separated by almost 3 centuries. Alexander created an empire that stretched from Greece to India in 13 years, and Caesar conquered Gaul and laid the foundation for the Roman Empire. Their armies symbolize 2 stages in the evolution of military arts, from heroic charisma to systematic professionalism. Alexander and Caesar are 2 great generals whose armies reflected different eras. Their comparison shows how wars have moved from individual feats to an organized machine, where strategy and logistics are more important than the individual hero. Phalanx or legion. Which tactic was more deadly? Alexander's army, infantry, phalanx, tight ranks of hoplites with spears 4 to 6 meters long. Effective on the plains, but vulnerable on the flanks. Cavalry, the elite, leading the attacks on the right wing. The blade tactic became his calling card. Additional forces, light infantry, archers, catapults. The Roman army under Caesar, infantry, 160 men, able to adapt to the terrain. Tactical infantry of Rome, weapons, a throwing spear for breaking the enemy's formation and shields, a gladius, a short and effective sword for close combat. Engineering skills, fortified camps were built in an hour. Siege engines, ballistae, onagers, were superior to their Macedonian counterparts. Alexander's phalanx dominated the plains, but the Roman formation made them versatile. If the Macedonians depended on ideal conditions, the Romans adapted to any. Rome's engineering skills allowed them to erect fortifications very quickly, which works against the Macedonians. Fighting a fortified enemy is much more difficult than in a normal field. Alexander's breakthrough or Roman endurance. Who would have lasted longer? Alexander, attacking the flanks after breaking through the center of the phalanx. Alexander could also deploy the phalanx for defense. The long spears used in the phalanx could be effective against an enemy at a distance of up to several meters, using the terrain to create traps and ambushes for the enemy to overwhelm them. To put the enemy to flight. Caesar, maneuver. Rome's light troops attack the flanks. Their best tactic was to outflank the phalanx, but this was not so easy. Strategy of attrition, as in Gaul. The Romans deprived the enemy of resources, and Macedonia is very dependent on resources on the spot. Alexander aimed for a quick victory through a breakthrough. Caesar, to wear out the enemy and exploit weak points in the enemy's defense. In a long conflict, the Romans would win due to stability, but the Macedonians could take advantage of surprise and catch the monotonous, heavy Roman military machine by surprise. The phalanx long spear versus the Roman throwing spear. Which weapon would be the symbol of victory? Weapons and armor. Macedonian long spear, advantage at range, but useless in close combat. Roman infantry throwing spear, destroyed shields and the phalanx formation. The gladius was effective in hand-to-hand combat. But the main difference in the campaign was logistics. Alexander relied on plunder and local resources. In long campaigns such as in India, the army suffered from hunger. Caesar, supply system through provinces, roads, and warehouses. In Gaul, he supported the army for years. The Saracen dominated at range, but the Roman pilum destroyed the phalanx formation. However, it would not be the blade that would be decisive, but logistics. The Romans fed the army, the Macedonians plundered, which makes the Macedonians more versatile in logistics, while the Roman legions will wait for the wagons with provisions. Macedonia, although dependent on the territory on which it is located, could quickly replenish provisions and move on. Plain, mountains, or siege, where would the fate of empires be decided? Battle on the plain. Thrace, Alexander builds a phalanx. The Hetaeroi attack the right flank. Caesar places the legions in 3 lines, reinforcing the flanks. After exchanging shells, the phalanx advances, but the second line of legionnaires maintains order. The Roman cavalry bypasses the Macedonians, forcing the phalanx to lose density. Mountain campaign Balkans. Caesar uses maniples to capture passes. Light troops harass the phalanx. Alexander, unable to deploy the phalanx, is forced to wage guerrilla warfare, which is contrary to his style. Siege. Alexander besieges the city, but Caesar builds counter-fortifications, as in Alesia. The Macedonians, deprived of resources, capitulate. On the plain, Alexander could have crushed the legions, but in the mountains the Romans would have torn the phalanx apart. The siege would have been Caesar's triumph. His camps were impregnable. The charisma of a hero or the calculation of a politician who would inspire soldiers to victory. Alexander, personal participation in battle. He led the attacks of the Hatoroi, inspiring the soldiers. Risk. The campaign in India put the army at risk. Caesar, psychology, motivated the soldiers with promises of land and glory. Propaganda. Veni, vidi, vici I came. I saw, I conquered. Examples. At Gaugamela, Alexander led the cavalry into attack, risking his life. At Pharsalus, Caesar wore down Pompey by exploiting the enemy's mistakes. Alexander led the army like a god, Caesar like a manager, but if the Macedonians lost their commander, they panicked, and the Romans continued the fight even without a commander. Why did Alexander and Caesar never meet, and why is it better for history? The chronological gap to 170 years makes the conflict a fantasy. However, it is precisely this impossibility that allows us to fantasize. Both armies could learn from each other, creating a new era of war. The historical gap makes the conflict a fantasy, but it is precisely this impossibility that allows us to fantasize. Both armies could learn from each other, creating a new era of war. Although we understand that Alexander the Great did not live to his gray years, but if Alexander the Great could strengthen his power and create a single state, in hundreds of years, the Macedonian dynasty would rule a large territory. What would have happened in ancient history? Such states would have stood in the same row. Like Carthage, the Roman Empire, and also the Macedonian Empire, Europe is divided into three huge states, and who would have known how this history would have developed? Write your thoughts on this topic in the comments. Why Rome became the Hellenistic world's successor, and what does it mean for future empires? This hypothetical conflict highlights the evolution of military art, from armies based on individual heroism to professional structures with a clear hierarchy. Alexander was remembered as a hero, Caesar as an architect of an empire. History chooses not the bravest, but the most resilient. Alexander's tactical victory or Caesar's strategic flexibility, who would have won in a long war? Rome showed that genius is important, but without a system it is powerless. Alexander was remembered as a hero, Caesar as an architect of an empire. History chooses not the bravest, but the most resilient. After the death of Alexander the Great, his empire fell. Alexander had a stunning genius, but he did not have time to organize the empire. Based on this, we see how empires fall behind a charismatic leader, and how empires survive and expand. Alexander might have won one battle, but Caesar the whole war. The Roman system would have been stronger than even the most brilliant commander. Based on discipline and law, in the long run, Caesar will win. What do you think? Write in the comments, and you can also watch other interesting videos on the channel.